Today we're going to upgrade our Duet board to RepRap firmware version 3. What's up everyone, Chris here, and today we will be updating to version 3 of RepRap firmware. And there are a lot of changes that occurred to be able to support the new version 3 line of Duet board. It will still run on the Duet 2 board and you get all those features, but you have to make a lot of changes in your configuration to make sure it's going to work with your machine correctly. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through all the steps and things that changed and get our printer upgraded to version 3. So hopefully this is another quick one. Let's get to the screen share and get everything updated. Here is the DWC to our 2020 Cube printer build. It is running a Duet Wi-Fi 2 and it's running 2. version of firmware. Now version 3. of firmware isn't just for the Duet 3 board like I said before. You can run it just fine on the Duet 2. And it does change up a few things and give you a little bit more flexibility and features. So first thing we'll check and see what firmware we have. We'll go to Settings, go to General, and we're on the latest version of the 2. 2.05.1. And the updating process of the firmware really isn't all that difficult. You just upload some files, reboot, and you should be good. The problem is what changed in the configuration. So just to be safe, the first thing I'm going to do is go to System Editor. I'm going to check this box right here. I'm going to right click, download a zip. So now I have a downloaded copy of all my config files just in case something bad happens. Back to General. You'll notice there's a couple different pieces to the firmware. You have the Wi-Fi server, the web interface, and the actual RepRap firmware. In the newer versions, you can just update the whole thing with one bin file. And I suggest that's what you do, because certain Wi-Fi servers and web interfaces don't go with other versions of RepRap. So try to keep them all intact. Now before, in the 1. versions, things were a little bit different. I do have a video explaining the difference in between 1. and 2, so you can check that out in the description. So now that we have a copy of our config, let's just go ahead and get updated. So if we head to GitHub and we read through the release notes for 3.1.1, it's going to suggest that it might just be easier for you to create a new configuration for 3.0 than it is to try to upgrade from 2.0. You can use the RepRap config tool. I have a video that walks you through that if you'd like to try it. It is for 2.0, but it should be really similar to 3.0. But I would like to try to go ahead and get this updated from scratch just so we can walk through all the different changes that were made from 2 to 3. Now you can't just jump from 2 to 3.1.1. You have to go to 3.0 first. And if you need to come from 1. all the way to 3.0, it's just easier to erase everything on the board and start from scratch with 3.1.1. You can check out that process in last Saturday's video, the RepRap firmware Rescue, link in the description. But we're going to continue on upgrading from 2. to 3. So let's scroll down to 3.0 right here. And to get to this version from 2. we need the Duet 2 and 3 firmware 3.0.zip. So we'll click on that. Then we'll head back to the Duet DWC. We'll head to Settings, and then here in General, we'll just hit Upload. We'll grab that zip file, hit Open. It's going to put everything into the /sys folder. When the upload's complete, it's going to ask you if you'd like to install them now. Let's go ahead and hit Yes. The update is complete. You can see firmware version 3.0 right here. So that was successful. Now normally when you update firmware on the Duet board, you're going to update RepRap, which is this firmware version right here, the Wi-Fi server, and the web interface. That's all contained in one bin file. The only caveat is when you have to do something like this, when we're going from the 2. family to the 3.0. So we used just the 3.0 zip file. We didn't update web server or web interface. Now when we go to 3.1.1, we can use the combined zip file and do all three to make sure they're synchronized. Some Wi-Fi server versions and web interface versions aren't going to work with certain RepRap firmware versions. Just be aware of that. So let's go back to the GitHub page. We'll scroll back to 3.1.1 up here. And we're going to get the Duet 2 combined firmware bin. If you have a 3 or a Maestro, here are the files for those. We'll grab this one. Back to the DWC, upload files, and we'll grab that combined bin file and hit Open. Firmware has been uploaded. We'll hit Yes again to update. We did get a JavaScript error because the web interface version has changed, so we can just refresh our browser. And now we have the new flashier interface from version 3. So the 3.0 upgrade was successful. But here's where things get really interesting. A lot of the parameters in your config file aren't going to work with this new version of firmware. A lot of different pins have changed, and other settings. All of that is available in the release overview from the Duet site. If you go through here, here's a list of everything that might have changed in RRF 3. So we pretty much need to go through all of these things and correct them in our config file. Now I don't use all of these, but anything I do use, I need to make sure the parameters are set correctly. So this might be kind of a lengthy process, but I want to walk through line by line in my config, show you the parameters that are going to change, and what it's going to take to get to the newest version of RepRap. So back to our DWC, let's go to System, and we'll just walk through our config file. So a lot of boards will have a standard M111 that you can turn on for debug. That didn't change in 3. M5550 names your printer in the DWC. They now require quotes be around your machine name, so we'll have to update that. Wi-Fi settings, M552, M555, and 575, no changes to these. 575 is for your panel do if you have one. 555 is for Marlin output. G21 work in millimeters, no change there. No change to G90. M83 stays the same, that is relative extruder distance. 669 is Core XY mode, no changes. M84 there are some changes, but those only apply if you're on a Duet 3 board. We can disregard them, we are on Duet 2 still. Assigning the motors in the direction with M569, there are no changes there. Same with lead screw locations. This is how you define where the lead screw is so you can do the multi-lead screw level. No changes to that one. M350 for microstep setting, no change there. But they have made changes to M574, and those are your end stop settings. In RepRap version 3, you have to call things by their pin name, and a lot of the pins have been renamed. So we're trying to get into a better method of calling pins by something you recognize rather than just a number. Now it doesn't impact me so much because I'm using a probe and I'm using stall guard, so sensorless homing. But if you have an in-stop switch, you're going to have to call it by that pin. So let's go over that real quick. The first thing that you have to do is get all of your different axes into a different M574 command. So you need one for X, Y, Z, E, any one that you want to use. So again, I do have stall guard, so I don't have to add near as much, but let's just assume that I have an X in-stop switch. So you'll do M574 X1, and then you need to do an S1. That tells it the type. There is no more S0. That used to do the inverting. And then you need to call the pin. So we'll do P, and then in quotes, X stop. Now, if you needed to invert the logic on that switch, you would put an exclamation point right here. So that's how you configure a manual switch going forward in version 3. Now, if you just use stall guard, you have to do a lot less. So for stall guard, you can still use S3. So I'm going to use it on X1 and Y1. There is also an S4 now. So if you're detecting stall guard from one axis, but you're using multiple motors, then it will stop all the motors at the same time. S3 should just work like the old school version 2 stall guard does, so S3 is just fine here. And still, if you have a probe as your end stop, M574Z1S2 will be just fine. That defines it as a probe. You will define what probe pin you use with M558. We'll see that in a moment. Moving on to M906, no change there, motor current works exactly the same. And your machine limits, there's no changes here either. M201, 203, M566, 208, all the same. Same with M92, set steps per millimeter, no changes, and no changes to M915, stall detect. Same thing. Now here's probably the hardest one and the biggest changes that they've made. Thermistors and heaters. Prior to version 3, every temperature sensor belonged to a heater. In version 3, the sensors are created and configured independently, and that includes thermistors. So let's just start with our bed, heater, and thermistor right here. We are now going to do an M308. That replaces the M305 command. Then you have to call out your sensor. The bed sensor is going to be S0. Then call the pin with a capital P in quotes. We're going to call the bed temp pin. Then we're going to configure it as a thermistor. So we do Y, then in quotes, thermistor. Then we set the resistance of that thermistor at 25C, which is 100K for this one. So we do T 100,000. Then we use the R to set the series resistor value. This thermistor is 4700. Then to go along with our thermistor, we have to create a heater. That's M950. We set the heater number for the bed. It's H0. Then we tell it the heater pin we want to use. We do C, in quotes, bed heat. Then we need to map it to the sensor that we created, the one up above, with a T, and we called that sensor 0. Now you still do need to use the M307 to set your ADC values. And we have ours down here for the bed previously. And they have removed a couple of parameters from this command, like F and Q. I don't use those, but if you do, be on the lookout for that. And you can no longer blank out a heater and use it as a dummy with this command. You used to be able to put in -1 for ADC, and then it would just let you use it without throwing an error. You can't do that anymore. Now you just don't create the heater on that pin. So I'm just going to comment out my 305 line. We don't need it anymore. And we'll make an update to our 307. Heater number's fine. I'm fine with the gain value at A. The dormant value at C. And the dead time in seconds is fine. V is for voltage. It is a 24 volt input. I am using an AC bed, so it doesn't really matter so much there. But go ahead and leave it whatever your PSU is. And then B, make sure you're using a PID tune along with these numbers. So we're good here. Let's move on to our hot end. Same kind of changes we need to make. We're going to comment out M305. We're going to create an M308. This one is going to be set to sensor 1. We're going to assign it its pin, so capital P, in quotes, E0 temp. Then we need to define it as a thermistor, so Y, in quotes, thermistor. It is a 100K thermistor, so T, 100,000. And then your series with a B, and for this E3D, it's 4725. And if the thermistor you're using calls for it, do still enter your C value, the one we have down in M305 right here. Just tag it onto the end of your M308. That still works. So that's the thermistor section. Now we'll define the heater and tell it what thermistor to use. So we need an M950, H1, heater 1, tell it its pin with a C, in quotes, E0 heat, and tell it we're using sensor 1, T1. Same thing with our ADC values down here. We can still use that M307. It is on H1. I'm fine with these ACD values. Voltage, B can be set to 0 because that disables bang bang and lets us use PID. One parameter I didn't mention on M307 is you can do an S. That will allow you to set the max amount of PWM. So 0 being off, 1 being full. So you can increment it in decimal. I'm just going to set it to allow it to use the whole thing. 1. That's comparable to something like 0 and 255 when you're setting PWM for something like a fan. You don't necessarily have to limit it. There is a default value. It's probably not a bad idea. So we'll go ahead and stick it on our bed M307 line as well. One other thing for the bed, we do need to run an M140 H0. That maps heated bed to heater 0 on the GUI. And then we're going to set max temp, M143 H0, and I don't want mine to go over 120, S120. And you can see I have an M143 down here for the hot end. We're going to add that up above just so it makes a little bit more sense. We'll set max temp for it, M143, H1 for the hot end heater, S300. And we'll just remove this line. M570 heater timeout, I have mine set to 360 seconds. That hasn't changed at all. But M106 fans, they have changed a bit. And that's because we still need to assign these pins with M950 commands and pin names like we just did with thermistors and heaters. So let's just start out right above our fans and we'll build some commands out here. M950, F0, that's for the fan 0 pin on the board. That's our part fan right now that's currently controlled by G-code. Then we need to assign it its pin name, so C, just like before, and in quotes, fan 0, and you can set its frequency with Q. Most fans, a 500 setting should be just fine. You still will need the M106 so you can tell it how you want that fan to be controlled. So still use M106 P0 for fan 0, but we need to tell it where it's assigned, so we're going to do S0, and then H-1, that just tells it it's not thermostatically controlled. It's our part fan. And I'm going to go over this one more time. Anything you assign a pin, you can reverse that pin with the exclamation point right in front of the pin name. Not going to work so much for the fan, but it is pretty useful on in-stops. There are quite a few parameters for this M106 that are no longer in use. A, F, and I aren't there, so you're going to be using them with this M950 instead. So let's do another one for our hot end fan. I like it to be thermostatically controlled. We have to define the pin, M950, fan 1, so F1, C, in quotes, fan 1 to call the pin by name, and we'll go ahead and set that frequency Q to 500 once again. Then our M106, P1, that will assign it to F1. S is no longer used for PWM. We need to select the pin that we set it to, so S1. H1 tells it that it is thermostatically controlled, and your T value is still your temperature. I'm going to leave mine at 70. That's when the fan should come on. These leftover commands down here aren't needed. I'm just going to remove these lines. Moving on to tool definitions, M563 hasn't changed that much, but you do have a limit of 50 tools now. So you can call values from 0 to 49. Just like before, P is your tool number. We got 0, there's only one tool here. D is your extruder drive. Again, 0, we only have one. And what heater it uses, H1, that is the thermistor and heater for the hot end. And then G10 is still useful. You can set your active and standby temperatures if you wish. No changes there. Dynamic acceleration adjustment, that is an advanced setting that I actually currently don't use, but there are no changes if you use it. M558, when we set up our probe, that has changed a bit. Pretty much anything that you need to assign pins, there's going to be changes because of the way that things are numbered now. The parameters are a little bit different. We can still use this M558, but P is going to be the probe number. That's P1. I do have it plugged into the probe pins on the board. Then we need to assign the pin. This should sound familiar by now. In quotes, zprobe.in is the pin name. H is your dive height. We'll set that to 5 millimeters. Set the feed rate that it moves. We'll go F120. And then travel speed in between probes. Let's do T6000. One last time, I'm going to remind you, if you put the exclamation point right here, that will invert the logic of those pins. So the biggest change here is how it's addressed and how you have to assign it to a pin. Remember, there used to be a lot of different modes that you could use, but those pretty much configured what pin you were using. So a lot of those no longer exist. Mode 9 still does exist for BL Touch because you have to use servo pins with it. But on a lot of different probes, P1's going to work just fine. Then G31, there are some changes to this one, but it's mostly features that have been added. I really don't use any of them. Now in version 3, it makes it easier to add multiple probes. You can use a K command to select which probe you'd like to use. There's also temperature compensation. You can use H, C, and S to set all that up. I currently don't have a probe that has a sensor in it, but we might look into that in the future. You never know. And then M557, no changes here. That does select your probe area. And then I just by default pick tool 0 at the end of my config file. Probably don't need that, but I just leave it in there out of habit. But that's it for my config file. So we'll hit save. It asks if we'd like to reset the board. We're going to say yes. And everything looks pretty good except this heater 0 here for the bed. So we definitely have some parameters that aren't correct. So let's go back and check in config.g, see what we messed up. And it looks like I just have a typo in bed heat right here. I'll take out this extra A. I did also notice that I didn't have a B value up here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that in my line. Probably doesn't make too much of a difference, but it doesn't hurt anything. So hopefully that fixes it. Let's hit save. We'll reboot one more time. And 21C looks a whole lot better than negative 230 something. So just a typo, no big deal. And just searching around the menu, I like the new look and feel of everything. Everything does seem to be working. I'll do some tests, but there are some settings that I kind of like. I went to General down here, and we now have a dark theme. So I'm definitely going to be using this going forward. Everything else seems to be pretty much the same, it's just a lot cleaner looking. I do like to have the height map option over here. You can take a look. It's a lot bigger preview, so that's nice. Also in status, they've changed up the baby stepping buttons. I never really liked those before. This is a much cleaner look. But all in all, it looks like a nice upgrade. Now that's probably not all the configuration changes you're going to have to make, but you might have to go through this slow and just correct them one by one. For instance, we have home files out here. So if you home all, I guarantee you're going to get a lot of errors. You can already see a lot of these parameters are obsolete. And that's because a lot of the settings in config.g are also echoed in those home files. So if you go to System, you can take a look at Home All. Mine just runs all the individual home files. But then if we just take a look at X, we have this G1 parameter. The special move character has changed. You can't use S any longer. It will be withdrawn soon. So anywhere you use these, you'll have to switch that to H. I do call out in the homes file that the end stops use the stall setting. I really don't need to do this twice, so I'll go ahead and comment that out. But you would have to change that up just like we did in config.g. Same way with these commands down here, we should really update these to H. And again down here, I reset to micro switches. This is so I can use these on different printers and just take things in and out. We can just comment this out because M574, that no longer works. And we can save that. But you're going to have to make all of those updates in these other files as well. I know I have more settings in Home Y, as well as probably some of these other settings. Like in Bed G, make sure you don't have any G31 settings in here that you need to update. A list of all the settings that have changed are on the Duet website. That will be in the description. After many configuration updates and tweaks, I was finally able to get my printer up and running on version 3, but they've made a lot of changes out there, and it could be somewhat frustrating. So consider going ahead and rerunning the RepRap configuration tool, just creating a new config for your printer if it's nothing too specific. But if you have to do it manually, Duet has lined out all the changes that they've made for version 3, and I do think it's a good way to go in version 3. Naming the pins, it's going to make things a lot easier going forward, but it could be a little rough during the transition, but we'll get through it together. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, please let me know in the comments, and I will see you on the next one.